Let us start. Now, welcome to another book talk organized by the International Society for the Critical Study of Divination. My name is Michael Lackner, and I have the honor to work as the president of the society. Let me see. I will just want to share. Yes, that's it. Okay. Now, that society was established in 2016 in the framework of the International Consortium for Research in the Humanities with a title, Fate, Freedom and Prognostication, Strategies of Coping with the Future in East Asia and Europe. And since 2023, the Society acts as a successor of the consortium, whose funding by the German Ministry of Education and Research lasted 14 years, from 2009 to 2023. And here you can see the website of this international consortium. During this period, we edited a book series with Brill Leiden, with 11 volumes by now and more volumes. To be precise, 7 volumes are in preparation. In addition, we also edit a journal entitled International Journal of Divination and Prognostication, also with Brill. And together with this book series, Prognostication in History, the consortium, and now this Society for the Critical Study of Divination have established the research of pre-modern, modern, and contemporary forms of prediction, forecasting, prognosis, briefly strategies of coping with the future as a solid and consolidated field within the humanities. And following now an idea of our colleague Dr. Li Gang, we started to stage a series of talks on the books that have been published so far. And it is my pleasure to host some of these talks, which we began with a book in prognostication in the series Prognostication in History, and now continue with other publications that are relevant to our topic. Here you have the information, and our talks can be found on YouTube. Now, let me briefly introduce today's speakers. Dr. Zeynep Korkman, the author of the book in question, is associate professor at UCLA. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a BA in sociology, Bosphorus University, Istanbul, Turkey, from 2000, in fact. Research interests are transnational feminisms, gender, labor, and effect, religion, secularism, and the public sphere, Turkey, and the larger Middle East. And apart from her book, which will be the topic of today's book talk, she also published an article, Mistranslations of the Critiques of Anti-Muslim Racism and the Repercussions for Transnational Feminist Solidarities. Now, the discussant is Dr. Kanan Tanir, who holds a PhD in sociology. So we have 2 sociologists today from Binghamton University in New York, with a dissertation, To Whom Does the Natural Come Naturally? Neoliberal Ideas of Mothering in Turkey. For an MA in Cultural Studies from the Istanbul Bilgi University in Turkey. At present, she is lecturer at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, and her scholarly interests are gender and ecology, sociology of motherhood, family, and she also works on qualitative methods. Now, our previous book talks were dedicated to divination in East Asia and Europe. These were the focal points of the International Consortium for Research in the Humanities. And I'm pleased that today we have the opportunity to explore both a new region, a new area, and a new theoretical approach. I am myself a sinologist in Chinese studies and really curious about the questions addressed in Dr. Korkman's book. So my first question to the author would be, what motivated her to choose this topic, this precise topic of divination? But I'm sure that she will answer herself this question in her presentation. Now the floor is up to you, Dr. Korkman. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lackner, for this generous and thought-provoking question and introduction. And I'm so excited about to learn about the society and how it was founded, and all the work that you're doing there in the journal and in the book series. It and that's kind of also just quick thanks to Gangly for organizing and John and Tahir so much for agreeing to be the discussant. And thank you everyone for being here to join us today. And thank you for the question, which links back to the refers as to like how I came into study fortune telling of all things. Of course, as you well know, and you're addressing in this important work that you're doing with the society, fortune telling has long been considered as kind of outside of the purview of social sciences, something that belongs to either societies of the past, who we assume sometimes to be irrational, and like or to societies of the non-West, who again we assume to be rational. And as a sociologist, when I got interested initially in these fortune-telling practices that I was seeing in my home country of Turkey in the 2000s, there were a lot of eyebrows in many ways, right? So for me, I was a graduate student who was really anxious, who was trying to, I'm sorry, a master's student who was trying to get into a graduate program in the United States to get a PhD in sociology. And on a day like that, I saw in Istanbul in a street this really interesting cafe that had this sign that said, get a Turkish coffee and get a free reading. And I walked in and I had a cup of coffee and somebody read my coffee grants and they told me that I would be, going abroad to, to reach my goals. And the whole interaction was very interesting, not only because it wasn't part of my everyday, but also because I was there with this woman I had never met before in a really intimate interaction that was out of nowhere, but she was like really reading into my like deep anxieties and wishes. And I was also feeling kind of awkward because uh, like it was a middle class place and she was obviously poorer. I was wondering about how much she was worth. She looked already tired. It was afternoon. The relationship was everything was so interesting that I was like, oh, this is something that maybe I might hang around and spend time learning. Like what happens in this interaction of fortune telling that is often dismissed as just entertainment, empty business at first, like charlatanry, right? Kind of people exploiting others to make money, whatnot. There is something interesting here. I felt there was something about gender, about femininity there that interested me as a feminist sociologist in the making. And there was something about the commercialization of this thing being increasingly in public in 2000s Turkey that attracted my interest as a social scientist as something that tells us about the broader changes in the society. And importantly, the labor aspects of it were really intriguing to me. So that was my entry into the field that ended in the book that I will be talking about today. And I'm so happy again to be in this really unique community where study of divination is taken seriously as a field of its own. And we get to learn from different folks in different disciplines and areas who look at this more closely. So my book, Gendered Fortunes, Divination, Precarity, and Affect in Postsecular Turkey, came out in 2023. And it focuses on this particular form of divination practiced in Turkey called coffee cup readings, or in Turkish kahve falı. So for this method of divination, the grounded coffee grounds are cooked with a little water in a kind of a coffee pot, and they're served but without filtering the grounds. Unlike the kind of most American versions of coffee, they're served in these tiny cups like espresso-sized cups, and then you drink it, but you're careful to leave the coffee grounds behind that kind of sink to the bottom of the cup. So use your lips like a sieve, and once you're finished, you close the saucer or the cup, shake it. You may say, whatever my wishes, whatever my heart's wishes, may that be my fortune. Turn it upside down in a quick motion that takes a little practice and let it cool off. So once dried, the coffee grounds are red. You can think of it as an ink blot test, right? Where you see this kind of images and visuals, and the reader interprets them to make comments about the recipient's mood, about their character, about past, present, and of course, importantly, future. So my book, Gendered Fortunes, analyzes the social life of coffee fortune telling and the shifting fortunes of its practitioners, the fortune tellers in contemporary Turkey. Indeed, women in Turkey have long been reading each other's cups, but that has been happening in the privacy of their homes. So this was a practice that was done with friends, neighbors, relatives, offering words of comfort, creating moments of joy. In the 2000s, however, something interesting happened, as I was telling you about. Women were joined by young and gay men to read fortunes in public and commercially, this time in this new and booming business type called fortune telling cafés. So my research is based on ethnographic research in these new fortune-telling businesses called fortune-telling cafes. And in my research, I show how fortune-telling cafes offer working and middle class, and in Turkish context, secular Muslim women as well as LGBTIQ folk in Turkey, a place to come together. And in this place, they explore their feelings, their fears and hopes, in the idiom, in the language of divination. And in the book, I show how these gender and sexual minorities navigate the broader social forces that shape their lives, such as religious and secular politics, such as heteropatriarchal pressures, such as capitalism and the labor precarity it brings, through divination, and how they do that in places and spaces and ways that are seen as minor, insignificant, irrational, unimportant, such as reading fortunes in fortune-telling cafes. Importantly, I also show that how they do this, women and LGBT folk explore their feelings and manage their intimate lives, but away from the spotlight of the government, who is trying to control those intimate lives increasingly, and away from the eyes of families or neighborhoods who may want to control them, and even away from feminist and queer politics, which is increasingly strong in Turkey, but under a lot of repression. So the book thus highlights the everyday lives and feelings of so-called Muslim Middle Eastern women and young and gay men in context of Turkey through the prism of divination. And just a quick note, I find it's important to note that I produced this knowledge against the backdrop of growing anti-Muslim racism, both in US here, but also in Europe. And I do this against the backdrop of weaponization and misuse of feminist and LGBT concerns, sometimes to justify violence against those communities. So, this is the broader context and a quick summary of the book. Let me give you an outline now for the talk that will be about 20 minutes. So today I will offer with a quick note on my methodology, what is my data and method. And then I will tell about the book in three parts that echoes the way the book is organized into three parts. First, I will tell you about the criminalization and then relative toleration of commercial fortune telling in Turkey as a window into the gendered politics of religion and secularism in the country. Secondly, I will talk about the labor of fortune telling, what that consists of, and the precarity, the insecure labor conditions of its participants as a window into the gendered labor under neoliberalism. And finally, I will conclude by illustrating the intimate, the feminized spaces fortune-telling practices conjure, the cafes, and how intimacy and publicness works in gendered ways in those places. So methodology, how did I collect data on divination? So my book draws upon extended ethnographic fieldwork in divination businesses in Istanbul, Turkey, meaning that I spend a lot of time there, just observing, taking notes, meeting people, talking to people, and getting my fortune told many, many, many times. I also drew up on autoethnography. This means that a lot of things that I felt and taught and experienced in the field became an important source of data, especially because many fortune telling sessions were private, so the ones that I could best observe were often my own. Furthermore, I draw upon historical research, very limited primary, mostly secondary data sources, as well as government and legal archives to learn about the evolution in the Turkish context and regulation of divination. Finally, I draw upon an analysis of public culture to explore the meanings and feelings that get attached to fortune telling beyond those field sites, what happens outside of the cafes. So let us zoom into an actual fortune telling cafe where you can find hundreds of these in Istanbul, where you buy an overpriced drink. So if a coffee is like $5 elsewhere, it will be like $30 in the fortune telling cafe. But it comes with a quote unquote complimentary reading where an in house reader will read your cup, sometimes in addition to some tarot cards that are, posted around the coffee or even other methods. And this photo is from the very, very first fortune-telling cafe of Turkey called the Coffee House of Angels in Turkish, Melekler Kahvesi. It was opened in 2001, a truly millennial phenomenon, and has since expanded to all three stories of this old, beautiful wooden house building, onto its front patio, back patio, really beaming business, employing dozens of readers and hosting hundreds of clients every day. Here, as well as in other fortune-telling cafes, typically the drink that comes with a complimentary quote-unquote reading is a Turkish cup of Turkish coffee, and the reader will read the cup as I have already shown you. And the arrangement is called a complimentary reading because they need to try and avoid charging for fortune telling itself legally in the books, due to the fact that commercial fortune telling has been a criminal offense in the country since early 20th century. And this wasn't always the case. Indeed, pre-20th century, in the Ottoman Empire that came before modern Turkey, fortune tellers were a legitimate part of society. The highest status ones were the highly educated Sunni Muslim male court astrologers who were reading fortunes of the royal family using their educated methods, and they're pictured in this miniature painting. At the bottom of the hierarchy of fortune tellers were illiterate Roma women, as well as Arab and or Black men. These categories were kind of collapsed into each other in that period. And these fortune tellers worked on the streets for, meager incomes, were seen as petty criminals sometimes. So this is illustrated in the postcard. During the Ottoman and Turkish modernization periods, however, starting from approximately 17th centuries into the 20th century, fortune tellers were gradually become subjected to a self-orientalizing gaze. That is to say, increasingly the Ottoman society started to see itself through the eyes of European and colonial powers, and thinking about fortune telling increasingly as too traditional, too irrational, too unsightly. And this culminated in the new Turkish Republic that was founded in 1923, which quickly in a few years outlawed fortune tellers alongside a host of other religious practitioners it thought didn't belong to a modern nation. After they banned fortune tellers were pushed out of the public sphere, they did not disappear. They were pushed into two privatized spheres. One was a criminalized and underground economy of male practitioners, and a second parallel one was a tolerated and domestic economy of housewives. Let me tell a little more about this. So, after criminalization, the most harshly persecuted fortune tellers in the country throughout the 20th and even 21st century continuing have been male practitioners called Hojas. Hoja is an basically a title for Islamic religious scholars and practitioners. And these figures may sometimes consult Quran as well as other mediums for divination. They may offer healing methods, write amulets in Arabic, and they have been the favorite subjects of vilification, criminalization, and media bashing. As in modern Turkey, they are posted as the kind of the evil kind of fortune tellers that has to be stopped. The stereotypical Hoja figure appears in all kinds of places throughout 20th century in court files, in reality shows, in novels, in movies. In this picture on the left, which is a poster for a movie that was made in 1950s, the Hoja appears very stereotypically depicted with the beard, the white turban, the green robe, writing supposedly an amulet on the exposed chest of a woman in front of him with a sinister smile implying sexual and economic exploitation. Uh, and in these narratives, invariably a secular male figure, usually a journalist or a policeman, sometimes a teacher, will bust the Hoja, expose his tricks, and save the women. At the same time, however, women engaging in popular practices in the privacy of their homes, like modern middle-class secular Muslim women, such as reading coffee grounds, or maybe wearing evil eye charms, were perceived, just as being women, just being, slightly superstitious housewives, insignificant, not worth busting out, but they were also kind of different enough, irrational enough to mark ordinary Turkish men as secular and rational by comparison. And today, commercial fortune telling in Turkey remains criminalized. Fortune telling cafés operate as marginally legal businesses, partially because they enjoy the kind of relative toleration that the feminized and tolerated method of coffee readings enjoy. Nonetheless, there has been occasional police raids and waves of persecution where the police will target a neighborhood or a city, taken into custody, fortune tellers, confiscating fortune telling materials as criminal evidence. It's also important to note in this context very quickly that notwithstanding this continuing secularist ban on divination, which came in early 20th century to make the society a little more modern and clean it from, these irrationalities, over the last century, a lot happened in Turkey. That would be the topic of another talk. But very quickly, Turkish politics of secularism and Islam has not stood still. Importantly, the founding ideology of the state, secularism, is still institutionally and ideologically durable, but no longer hegemonic, given Islamism's increasingly authoritarian dominance over the last 2 decades in the country. And this creates what I call in the book a post-secular condition where the status and the features of secular and secularist citizens of Turkey do not feel safe or secure anymore. They feel marginalized both culturally, economically, and politically. So, in an irony of history, it is these secular and secularist women and young and gay men of Turkey who go to fortune telling cafes to address their anxieties about their futures whenever these personal fortunes feel limited by, among other things, the waning prospects of the very secularist project that banned and criminalized fortune tellers in the first place. So, these places are mostly used by these people. Let me now move to the second part of the story and leave you with these sites from 2 other fortune-telling cafes as I tell you about how fortune-telling provide ways to navigate labor precarity, what kind of labor it constitutes, and how it is used by its participants. So as I've already mentioned, as a feminized practice, serving someone coffee and reading their cup has long been an everyday mode of care, as a form of caring labor, as feminist scholars call it, a way of relaxing someone, supporting someone, relating to someone, and it's been one of those unpaid feminized labors in the domestic sphere, kind of similar, you can think of it as similar to parenting, emotional support, all kinds of things that wives, mothers are expected to do within the household. In the 2000s, however, more and more working and middle class women, joined by young and gay men, turned this long standing feminized practice of reading fortunes into an opportunity for paid work in fortune-telling cafés. So when I asked people, so what do you do here? Like, what is this work and how do you know? They would, majority of them would respond, what they do is feeling, in Turkish hissetmek. And following their lead, I conceptualize fortune telling as a labor of feeling. And I argue this form of fortune telling depends upon feeling the client and making the client feel. Let me tell a little bit more about this. A description that I came after a long observation and being socialized into this world of fortune telling. So I noticed as I learned how increasingly and got to observe how fortune telling sessions work in the field, that this kind of feeling the client and making the client feel depends upon, first of all, conjuring this enchanted, intense intersubjective space between the reader and their client, tension in the air, expectation, focus. And summoning such intensity often takes a charismatic presence, an impressive opening on the part of the reader, but it also depends a lot on the recipient, who should be ideally attention focused, who is literate in the genre, who is familiar with the social practice and what to expect, and who is quote unquote open, as divination practitioners call it, who is open to be read, who is open to be affected, who provides feedback into the process, right? As an interpretation comes, maybe they raise an eyebrow if it's not hitting the mark, or maybe they not ask questions, etc. So through that kind of feedback, the reader feels the client, and the client can make to feel different feelings throughout reading. So as this kind of initial interaction starts, the fortune teller starts narrating some gendered scenarios, maybe of bliss or maybe of despair, and invites the client in, so to speak, to think of themselves as the very subject of these scenarios. So, for example, maybe they'll tell you, which I mean, they have told me, you have been heartbroken. You ask yourself why. Be patient. You will meet someone. You will meet someone whose name has the letters and A. Okay, this person will be a good match for you. So when the clients hear that, right, the fortune telling is extending an invitation to them to imagine themselves as the very subject of the situations being described and imagine how that feels, inhabit that imaginary scene. And in this way, the reader articulates potential desires and fears for the client to identify with, and client feels them out, feels the fit or not. Importantly, the commercialization of this interaction, these feeling labors, provides a medium to navigate labor precarity. And this is true both for workers and clients alike. On the supply end of this economy, divinations allow poorer women and young and gay men, and especially those without other marketable skills, not exclusively but especially, to make a living through fortune telling amidst widespread labor precarity. And this economic precarity is not only intensified in the last 2 decades or longer, particularly under further neoliberalization of Turkish economy, but it's also unevenly distributed across gender and sexuality lines. So women, LGBTIQ folk are more likely to be unemployed, slotted into informal work, insecure jobs, etc., as well as also economic precarity in this phase unevenly distributed along ethnic, racial, national citizenship lines. So the majority of cafe workers are women, but those are often women who have Turkish citizenship, who are or can pass as ethnically Turkish, who speak the Turkish with the right urban Istanbuli accent. Roma women, for example, who have historically and even today continue to read fortunes on the streets, are excluded. So are Syrian refugees who very occasionally can find jobs as translators for Arab tourists who are visiting Turkey from the region and who may come to fortune-telling cafes. Um, so in the cafes, people who are lucky enough actually to get a job there, the readers' work is informal, devalued, stigmatized, and even at the risk of being criminalized, as we talked about. But these qualities do not stand out as too extraordinary in a context where there is high unemployment, discrimination, informal and insecure work as kind of the norm for most working class women, LGBTIQ folk, and even youth. On the demand end of this economy, the middle class clients themselves are increasingly precarious. They worry about the next economic crisis and whether their children will have the same middle class status they once were able to achieve. So they come to the cafes to get readings to soothe their anxieties, to replenish their spirits at the face of this mounting uncertainty. And in this context, I argue fortune telling becomes a way to navigate precarity for both the clients and workers. Nonetheless, and this brings us to the last part of the book that I want to tell you a little bit about today. The feeling labors of divination, these feminized labors, produce more than just precarity or profits for donors. They also produce precious sociabilities, precious spaces for gender and sexual minorities to come together and to support each other. So let me now tell you about the final part of the story about sociability, intimacy, publicness in these cafes. Feminized fortune-telling practices, I argue in the book, summon hospitable places for these anxious gender and sexual minorities to come together as patrons as well as workers of these businesses. In these businesses, you will notice a majority of women clients, joined by a minority of young and gay men, both as readers and clients, and rarely adult heterosexual men. If they're there, they're usually the owners or maybe the cooks at the business, but rarely readers, very rarely readers, almost exclusively not, or clients. So, for these reasons, I call these places feminized publics, as their members are those who are disadvantaged, who are feminized, so to speak, in the heteropatriarchal hierarchies of age, gender, sexualities of women, young and gay men. And the indoors photo that I'm showing you on this slide is a shot from one of the special women-only rooms of the Coffee House of Angels, the first fortune-telling cafe you've seen a picture a little earlier. So recognize how the room is decorated, kind of like a living room, domesticating and feminizing the space. Also note on the wall, there's a calendar with a portrait of Atatürk, that's like the red one. Atatürk is the secularist founder of the country of Turkey, and his portrait is actually a common sight in secularist living rooms, middle class living rooms across the country. The irony, of course, is that he's the one who criminalized fortune telling in the first place. In the other photo, you see one of the oldest fortune telling cafes in Istanbul, opened in 2003, 2 years after the other one. This place is called a women's coffee house, Kadınlar Kahvesi in Turkish, literally announcing itself as a feminized place, as a place for women. Interestingly, though, the phrase women's coffee house is an oxymoron in Turkish. Because in Turkish, the word coffee house, kahvehane, actually refers to male-only public spaces where these traditional establishments only men go to drink coffee. Women can go out in public to drink coffee, but those places are called cafés, and they are mixed gender places. They're not oriented specifically to women. So fortune-telling cafes intervene in this dualistic spatial gender regime in Turkey, where they're not gender segregated, like women-only spaces or men-only coffee houses, but they provide these feminized spaces where women and younger gay men feel comfortable in the company of each other. And importantly, these places exist under a broader public sphere, particularly in the last 2 decades, where intimate and private issues such as who's gonna marry who, issues about sexuality, family, reproduction, etc., are increasingly talked about in more and more explicit and specific ways and prescribed, both by the gender conservative government but also by feminist and queer activists. So in such a milieu, women and young and gay men come to these spaces to talk about those very private issues, talk about their romantic desires, family plans, right, etc. But they get to do so with the support from their peers, in the company of their peers, and away from the prying eyes of their family, their community, and the broader political actors. And in divinations, you often see, kind of very typical heteronormative scenarios. You're going to get married, you're going to have two children, blah, blah, right? But there are also a lot that comes about, like partners cheating, husbands losing jobs, pregnancies lost, so all the glitches, so to speak, of that kind of gender normative life, as well as diversions and departures from it. So, for example, lesbian women, gay men, trans folk not only read fortunes in these businesses, but also make room for uh, gender non-conforming desires in their readings. This might look like taking benefit of the fact that in Turkish personal pronouns are not gendered, so everybody's a they, there is no he or she. So it might look like pointing to a tarot card with the same sex category of the reader, etc. And what really makes fortune telling cafes important and safer spaces to explore these intimate issues for these groups is a novel combination of feminized intimacy with public anonymity. So at home, when it's friends, neighbors, relatives, reading cups, it can be a means of relating, relaxing someone, but also of extracting information, gossiping, and even controlling someone. So in this cartoon by cartoonist Pia Madre in Turkey, the grandma is reading her granddaughter's cup, and she starts, you're alone with a tall person," which suggests that a taller person would be male. And she is interested. She follows up, but then the grandma's expression changes. She looks upset and abruptly closes the cup before the reading is over. And the granddaughter inquires, "What's wrong, Granny?" And to which she responds, "And you're shamelessly asking," implying that, like she's shaming her for the prediction or her desire of interest, right, in the prediction that she would be alone with a male. So this is what I call the dark side of socially embedded intimacies, that it can become, especially in family and neighborhood context, a mechanism of control, pressure, even violence. In cafes, however, people exchange readings in this passing interaction with a stranger. The cafe readers cannot gossip. I mean, they can tell all about you, but they don't know the right person who know you to make that gossip socially effective. So they offer this particular type of anonymity that is especially valuable for people whose personal lives are otherwise disciplined in context of family, in context of community, as well as in the larger public policy spheres. So as such, I argue that these cafes provide gender and sexual minorities with a safer space to manage their intimate feelings, lives, and futures. But it happens, unfortunately, as I explained earlier, only at the expense of further exploitation and precaritization and even criminalization of these very same groups. Let me conclude here, and I would like to share my email with folks who may be joining us today if they want to reach out later with any questions or comments. But I want to pass it now back to you, Professor Lackner and Canan Tahir, for thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to Canan's engagement.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Fascinating book and fascinating presentation. Thank you very much. Before I hand over to Dr. Tanya, I would just like to ask, I mean, to what extent, I mean, okay, we're all in these, even in China, you had to face, the verdict of superstition, in the early 20s, in fact. So there's a timely coincidence, really, that you can observe both in China and in Turkey. But to what extent do these fortune tellers relate to traditional methods? I observed that in one of the cafes, tarot was, sort of signaled as a technique. In China, usually, I mean, fortune tellers would either relate to modern methods, Western methods like tarot, which are not modern at all, as you know, and to their traditional techniques that come from times of old, etc., etc. And I wonder whether you can just briefly respond because we have to leave time enough for Dr. Tanya.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for this question. Very relevant. Indeed, the practitioners in Turkey kind of do a careful balancing act. On the one hand, things like water readings or some other methods of divination are recognized as traditional and authentic and real and powerful in some ways. So they may be more attractive to the clients, but they come with higher risk of criminalization for the precise reasons, right? So, on the other hand, things like tarot readings, Reiki healings, what are kind of these uh, supposedly modern, but of course, I mean, we know they're kind of new age appropriations of these of other people's traditions, circulate as sounding more modern, more contemporary, more Western, but they also kind of sometimes fall a little more flat, risking perceived as not authentic in this context. So, coffee fortune telling strikes the right balance for many readers to land in a way that is recognized as authentic, but also not explicitly religious or perceived as traditional in the way that it would attract criminalization. Although there is definitely increasing reliance on those New Age methods that are sometimes in combination and sometimes often in the underground or in kind of under the table ways, often exclusively offered. Thank you very much for this question.
Thank you. Thank you. Now the floor is open to Dr. Kanan Tanir from the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Please.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing this and giving me an opportunity to be engaged in this really creative conversation. It's an honor. So, as you have heard, Professor Korkman uses feeling as a lens through which we can observe how broader social formations cut across the everyday lives of ordinary individuals. And these are usually unseen, maybe undermined groups of individuals. Now, I want to start by saying this is highly appropriate, considering that the fortune telling businesses are specifically about navigating feelings and anxieties or vulnerabilities or negotiating feelings about the world. And often for those who happen to be impacted by the neoliberal conditions of fluctuation, precarity, and insecurity. So, in that sense, I think fortune tellers become their listeners while they're not listened to. And they become their voice in a way, bringing their predicaments to the surface. So, in fact, fortune telling is a perfect instance to look at as a sort of cross section to ponder about the intersection of both local and global macro structures with the micro level of everyday lives. And I think exactly because of this, Dr. Korkman's work addresses a very important gap in the contemporary debates around gendered politics of a post-secular neoliberal Turkey. I'm not sure if the audience here is familiar with the scholarship, but in this field, if anyone's familiar, they will know that there's been a healthy amount of studies around gender politics of the early Turkish Republic, the formation of the early state, or how secularization transformed gender relations in mostly like a Western-facing manner. And in the last few decades, too, the debates on the role of popular religious conservatism, legal reforms, and official discourse, and so on, have all been well discussed. But as soon as you read Dr. Korkman's work, you recognize there's something a little bit different here because these previous debates, like despite the wealth of knowledge and very innovative perspectives they had all offered, maybe they were missing a sense of like how grounded these ideas really were in the trenches of daily life, in the minds of everyday individuals. So I would say this is one of the biggest strengths of Dr. Korkman's work, one that comes from being very well grounded, or maybe we can say being firmly situated in the ordinary, mundane way of things. So divination and fortune telling as a gendered practice is at the center of her analysis, but she turns it into the seemingly insignificant and undermined practice into a focus through which we can interpret the gendered affective economy of the contemporary realm. So with that, she's able to clearly show how the complex layers of I will quote from her in her own words, a global tide of religiously accented gender conservatism, secular hegemonic decline, political authoritarianism, and economic neoliberalism. How all these layers shape our affective worlds of like unseen, marginalized, ordinary actors. And what makes her endeavor a successful one is the vivid, convincing use of the evidence from the ground. This allows the reader to easily comprehend the manifestation of these social dynamics in the everyday life. And so the book, in short, like it definitely brings the out there and abstract capacity of these well-discussed binary oppositions of such as like religion versus secularity, tradition versus modernity, or public versus private. All these concepts come down to earth with this ethnographic detail. And it showcases well how they play out in a much more dynamic way than they are presented in the material reality. They continuously shift throughout history, so they're very well immersed in historical conditions. Also, regarding those binary oppositions, I would add that her refusal to buy into these simplistic sort of thinking is going in the book, in the narrative, is going well beyond the surface. It doesn't come across just as a simple declaration of her epistemological stance, but she clearly detangles these gendered conceptions of religion, secularity, and tradition with a genealogical approach, which shows the reader, rather than telling, shows the reader why we can't take them for granted, because we see that they're simply not sufficient to explain the complex reality, neither of historical background or of current reality. So, in the first part, as she presented, the book goes through historical shifts in the gendered construction of the secular. And throughout that discussion, how the gendered boundaries between the religious and the secular are constructed are exposed. And we are given a glimpse into the history of Turkish modernization with regards to how divination practices were seen, along with the trend of secularization. So in this part, in the first part, we can clearly see how the practice of fortune telling, although considered quote unquote feminine foible, can become a significant tool. This first part establishes the significance of fortune telling as a way to inquire into the ways in which women and other minorities subjects handle the precariousness and uncertainties of the post-secular neoliberal context. And after that, in the second part, we are led to an examination of the contemporary spaces where fortune-telling practices take place. And this is the part that is really rich with ethnographic detail. And through her vivid descriptions, the reader is shown how fortune-telling cafés once again defy the diametric opposition between public and private and create disruptive opportunities. Dr. Korkman efficiently calls this neoliberal intimization of the public sphere. So this is clearly a response to previous feminist scholarship that focuses on exclusion of women from the public space, showing that inclusion does not guarantee equality. So we are also warned against an easy and quick reading of this as a feminist alternative. It can be seen as an opportunity for marginalized groups, but it does not always necessarily translate into that. As she also mentions, divinations may and often do offer heteropatriarchal scenarios, and they suggest conformity too. So having laid all of that out, the final section then locates current forms of divination, fortune telling, strictly within the contemporary context of neoliberal restructuration of the economy, and with that, inevitably, the precarization of labor as well. So I would argue this is the part where the book makes a very novel contribution to the studies of affect and divination by placing them into economic relations, neoliberal restructuring of the economy, and increasingly precarious labor market. So divination, and in her words, a labor of feeling, becomes a commodity and is defined by precarity. And both the gendered affective precarity of the client and the gendered labor precarity of the readers. So in a sense, we can say we're looking at the political economy of divination from a point of view that's been immersed in a unique local history, with the term feeling labors emphasizing, again, the situatedness of the analysis. It is important in this last part that we see it is this unique contingent local context that defines what kind of practices can turn into spiritual entrepreneurship. But at the same time, the growing spirit of an uneven distribution of neoliberal precarity is globally continuous. So the same precarity also constitutes financial opportunity for business owners and workers themselves, who end up having to self-monitor, self-manage to optimize their performance. So the feeling labor is more than just the commodified labor that produces profit, like she put it herself in the talk. The feeling labors are shaped by neoliberal logic of self-entrepreneurship, self-management, but they also represent the gendered frustrations, anxieties, aspirations of the minorities in millennial Turkey. So throughout the whole book, there are distinct threads of gendered affective economy around divination, but all of them are very well woven, I would say, into contemporary neoliberal context with the specific contingencies of a religiously conservative, increasingly authoritarian Turkey. And centering on feeling as an analytical lens allows her to question feminism's engagement with affect, intimacy, private-public, specifically private-public distinctions and definitions. And the precarious conduct of such practices complicates this analysis further, demonstrating the possibilities for reconfiguration of the public, I would say. I want to finish by saying, being so rich with interesting ethnographic data and in close dialogue with theory, the book presents a very convincing case for reading everyday level of relations as immersed in a framework of broad historical conditions. And it showcases the infusion of those broad factors, economic factors, social factors, into the daily life, daily practices in usually unrecognized, very subtle ways. And I would also say because of this, it's an interesting read for ethnographers particularly, but also, of course, divination, gendered affect, Middle Eastern studies. Those who are students of religion and secularism may all benefit very well from this book. And I have a few questions, but we can also open the floor to, I guess, other questions as well. If you...
Thank you for this comment. I wish that every author of an excellent book had an equally excellent discussant. Many thanks. Our time is limited, but and that, of course, as a person in Chinese studies, I would say the issue of secularization, the issue of economy, the issue of feeling, and the economies of feeling. I mean, that invites for a comparative study. So we will keep in touch. And I would like to give, 5 minutes to Dr. Korkman just for a reply, a response to these excellent comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Tanir, for this such thoughtful, such generous commentary. And Professor Lackner, yes, comparative thinking, and I would love to learn more from your work and the kind of the community around scholarly community around divination that you're building with this project. So, just a quick response. One thing that I heard Professor Tanner emphasizing is the kind of relationship between macro and micro levels of society, right? And that was something that really I was excited to think about very reflexively in this work. How do we think about those really everyday, really minor, kind of insignificant, often looked down upon, looked away from practices such as divination, especially when those are done by women and gay men and young people, right? Those kind of underprivileged groups in society whose activities are already devalued. How do we uplift those into the kind of status of significance that not only they become subjects of scholarly understanding and also of debate as they deserve, but also as a feminist, as a scholar of gendered labor, right? Into a place where people who work around labor and labor justice, people who work around issues of gender and sexuality and justice around those issues, or people who think critically about state authoritarianism, whether it's in a secularist or religious forms, right? And to think about justice around those issues can recognize the significance, the importance of everyday life, these minor practices, such as divination, such as things that women do, gay men do, as worth looking at, as worth valuing, as worth seeing the potential. And this reflected in the book, for example, in ways of not only theorizing, but also presenting the data, bringing together right anecdotes or stories and voices from the research field with analysis. Yeah, I leave it here. I think in the interest of time, thank you so much for emphasizing and kind of giving us a gist of what you felt as the important parts of the book.
Thank you very much for this response. Restoring the dignity to certain practices, restoring the dignity, isn't that? This is in fact, the question we are facing. Okay, thank you very much for this interesting conversation. And I'm really looking forward to further exchange, and we will try to stage manage that as, just like we did with this book talk. Thank you very much. And thanks to the audience. They have joined a bit later than we expected, but they're all there. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here despite a few pickups, and thank you for the invitation and organizing. Bye.
Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Sağ ol Canan tekrar.
Rica ederim.
Hoşça kal. Bye everyone.
It's like
Okay.
the event is scheduled in 5 minutes, but no one is here.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, otherwise we would have to postpone it. And leave our recording.
But this is one of the problems that we actually